Here to introduce our keynote speaker is Vice Admiral Richard Hunt, the Director of the Navy Staff. Vice Admiral Hunt is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin in Madison and the Naval Postgraduate School. He's enjoyed a distinguished surface warfare career, having commanded the USS Cromlin, USS Philippine Sea, Carrier Strike Group 6. He served as a commander of Combined Joint Task Force Horn of Africa under the Central Command. Went on to command the 3rd Fleet, a great heritage there. Served as commander of Naval Surface Forces before assuming his present assignment as the Director of Navy Staff. Please help me welcome Vice Admiral Hunt.
All right, now the Undersecretary said don't talk more than 15 minutes, so I'm going to keep this pretty quick. First of all, good evening to everybody. What a wonderful event. This is really capping off a great day, and appreciate all the work for all the folks that put this together for us. Glad to be here tonight as we celebrate the commemoration of the Battle of Midway. Now, I hope that folks had a chance to get down to the Navy Memorial today, because I think that was a great way to start this. The weather cooperated. And frankly, just being there with the Midway veterans, sitting up there and in front of that sea of white that we had out there is just very moving. And we're glad to have each and every one of you with us tonight. It means so much to us, and it really means a lot to our sailors. The biggest thing, I think, is seeing our vets, the folks that sacrificed in World War II and in other engagements that have followed. For them to get an understanding of the sacrifice that you did. You're the leaders that have set the stage for those of us that serve today. So again, thank you, all of the Midway veterans. Now I have the great privilege to introduce our speaker this evening, the former Undersecretary of the Navy, Bob Work. Bob has the well-deserved reputation of being an unqualified supporter of our Navy, both today and in the future. And I've had the great pleasure of working with him over the last year in Navy staff. I can't think of a better supporter than Secretary Work has been. Mr. Work joined the Department of the Navy in May of 2009, and he arrived with a superb reputation amongst the national security experts. A former Marine colonel, he drew upon a 27-year military career that included command of artillery batteries, a battalion, a Marine base. And as he worked the defense analyst aspect in Washington think tanks, developed a great reputation there. He established a strong reputation in particular as a war gamer, a strategist, and a force structure analyst. His superb reputation led to his assignment in 2008 as a member of President Obama's Defense Transition Team, and ultimately as Undersecretary of the Navy. Historically, a service undersecretary is charged with managing the day-to-day activities of the department in order to allow the secretary to engage outwardly on more strategic issues. Bob Work, however, was much, much more. Over the past 4 years, he established himself as a master of detail. He threw himself into the coordination meetings at all levels and across a broad portfolio of issues. Everyone in the Pentagon quickly came to realize that they needed to step up their game in order to know more about a topic than the Undersecretary. As a leader within the surface warfare community, I'm particularly thankful for Mr. Work's strong support and his intellectual rigor taking care of the littoral combat ship. He's been a great advocate. Thank you for that, sir. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, and so it was that he left the department earlier this spring to take a new and challenging position as the Chief Executive Officer of the Center of New American Security, a think tank with a strong reputation for disruptive thinking based here in Washington, D.C. Tonight it is my great pleasure to welcome one of our most effective undersecretaries ever to serve the department, the Honorable Robert O'Rourke, back home to the Navy, even if it's for a short period of time, as he addresses the topic of how a peacetime Navy between two world wars prepared itself for the Battle of Midway. Secretary O'Rourke.
Well, thank you, Rick, for that very long and far too kind introduction. Secretary Ball, distinguished flags, both active and retired, past and present members, allies, partners, and supporters of our glorious Navy Marine Corps team, and to all of the spouses and partners and significant others who are with us tonight, providing your support to all of us. I have to tell you that when I left as the Undersecretary on the 22nd of March, I didn't realize that when I go in front of an audience and say, "Hey, what did you do?" and I said I was the Undersecretary of the Navy, and they say, "Okay, you're 60 years old and you work for a secretary." Loser! So I can't tell you how happy I am to speak with an audience who actually knows what the Undersecretary does. Now tonight we celebrate the heroic and even epic efforts of the Navy Marine Corps team in their greatest ever victory at sea, the Battle of Midway, which started this very day, 71 years ago. Now I feel kind of like a pretender here. Tom Hone, who's here with us tonight, just published a seminal book on the Battle of Midway. He should be the one giving this speech, and I thought long and hard of just having my speech saying, "And I'd like to introduce Tom Hone." But I'll try to give it a whirl and see what happens. Now, during my time as Undersecretary, I had reason to think a lot about the Battle of Midway, a lot more than you might think, because it was a victory that occurred only 7 months into a war. It was fought after a prolonged period of peace, and after an even longer period of time during which the United States Navy had never fought a naval opponent as skilled as they, or for stakes so large. And I think that victory was even more impressive because it occurred on the heels of a stunning surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, which literally rocked the Navy Marine Corps team and the entire nation back on its heels. And it was long before the great influx of conscripts that came into our warfighting services to fight the war. So this was a battle that was fought really by professional officers and sailors who had known only peace in their long careers. The U.S. hadn't fought a war in 24 years, and it had not fought a major naval battle in 44 years. And even then, it was against an opponent who was really woefully unprepared, far inferior in equipment, training, readiness, and spirit. But even so, that peacetime Navy and Marine Corps team were ready when called upon under the direst of circumstances. So the Undersecretary of the Navy and the Secretary have Title X authority. We're responsible for organizing, training, and equipping the Navy Marine Corps team. And I can't tell you how many times I asked myself, time and time again, how did the sailors, like the 7 heroes who are here with us tonight, how did they swing it? How did they do it? And how do we make sure that the next time we find ourselves fighting a battle at sea under such long odds, and after a prolonged period of operating in tactical sanctuaries at sea and conducting show-the-flag missions, that our future Navy Marine Corps team will be able to respond to the challenge as well as those heroes did on June 4th, 1942. Now, when trying to answer this question, I find myself asking another question. And it's an important one, and one we shouldn't shy away from. Was the victory at Midway just more a matter of luck than skill? After all, did not the 1942 Navy Marine Corps team themselves name the assembly point for their outgunned forces Point Luck? As they assemble their forces in the mid-Pacific, awaiting a vastly superior, numerically superior force, did the Navy Marine Corps team just resign themselves and simply surrender to the vagaries of chance? So when I was asked to give this speech, I told Jerry Hendricks, the outstanding director of our Naval History and Heritage Command, there is nobody better right now. I said, Jerry, I want you to help me write this speech, and the angle I want to take is, how was a Navy, after such a long period of time, able to go out and kick butt? And I asked him to help me, tell me what the Navy and Marine Corps team did in that long period of peace to retain and hone a warfighting edge, even while at peace. So I'd like to thank Jerry and all of his analysts who helped put this speech together. I couldn't have done it without them. Now, while they were helping me gather up data, I started thinking about the term luck. And here I was lucky enough to come across an article entitled How to Make Your Own Luck, written by Erika Anderson for Forbes magazine. Now, Erika started out by defining the term luck. Just said it's a force that brings good fortune or adversity. Second, it's the events or circumstances that operate for or against an individual or organization. And she made a simple observation, and one that really resonated with me. How one perceives that mysterious force that brings good fortune or adversary comes down to whether one believes they are primarily responsible for their own fate, or if they believe that their lives are determined primarily by forces beyond their control or understanding. Now, she was a member of the former school, and she recalled a quote attributed to Branch Rickey, a seminal figure in American baseball, recently portrayed by Harrison Ford in a very good movie, 42, the story of Jackie Robinson. Branch Rickey said, "Luck is the residue of design." In other words, what in Branch Rickey's school of luck, the people we call lucky are simply those who are better able to recognize and take advantage of circumstances because they have a pre-planned design or plan. And as many of you in this audience know, the victory at Midway did have some events or circumstances that broke our way. We arrived right at the time when Japanese aircraft were on the decks of the enemy carriers. But if luck had any overriding influence on the final outcome at the Battle of Midway, it was primarily because of the residue of a coherent design and plans that were developed over decades of peace. Now, the intellectual engine behind this, as many of you know, was the Naval War College. Founded by Commodore Stephen Luce in 1884, it was the thoughts and writings of Alfred Thayer Mahan who really put that institution on the strategic map. And Mahan's writing, beginning with the seminal The Influence of Sea Power on History, forecast the conflict in the Pacific. It was going to be within the horizon of the United States Navy's strategic planning. And it was his dedication to the Naval War College and focus that kept that focus on that particular problem alive, even when funding for the school was cut and the number of students were cut also. Now, following World War I, another great Navy admiral, Admiral William Sims, he returned from Europe to take up the presidency of the Naval War College. Now, he was always a great innovator, and as historians know, he was also a great troublemaker. And he presided over the introduction of wargaming on a grand scale. And in the process, he created an environment and culture that forced the exploration of new technologies, new weapons, new ideas, like submarines, aircraft, and fleet trains. And he made them the central part of the war games. But more importantly, these war games inculcated throughout the Navy officer corps why it was so important to question the status quo. And he practiced what he preached, writing a letter to Bradley Fisk in 1921, that the battleship was dead, even though both he and Fisk were battleship admirals. Now, many of the future leaders of the Navy and many of the people who had a direct bearing on the outcome of Midway, including Admirals King, Nimitz, and Halsey, they all attended the War College in the interwar years. And during these time, most of the officers and people who supported the Navy were good Mahan adherents. And they thought that an oceanic war would be decided through a small number of very large, decisive battles at sea. And in the Pacific, they felt that the Asian opponent increasingly identified as the Japanese, would challenge the United States' position in the Philippines, and the U.S. fleet, largely based on the West Coast, would sortie out across the Pacific, engage in a large battleship fight near the island archipelago, and it was going to be a relatively short war. Sounded great. We've been there, done that. I'm sure you all know. Wars are always longer than you expect. And that's what the Navy War College determined through their war games and through subsequent fleet exercises. And it revealed that the war was going to be much longer than you thought, and that new technologies like submarines and airplanes and amphibious ships, they were all going to prove useful, even if not necessarily understood. So the war games became a time to test new warfighting and organizational concepts on the floor using models. And the fleet exercises that followed them tested out the most promising of these concepts. And it created a virtuous cycle of wargaming and exercises and back and forth. And it created a nimbleness of mind in the entire officer corps of the Navy and a willingness, again, to make changes. So the battleship admirals, coming out of World War I, they came to the conclusion that, hey, submarines would be great scouts for the battleship. Now, of course, they thought the Army cavalry should be great scouts for the battleship, too. In fact, pretty much everything was going to be a great scout for the battleships. But the war games on the tables at Newport supported this view for a while, but when you went to the fleet and put them in exercises, you really couldn't make the scouting role work. The boats were simply too slow to operate as the eyes of the fleet, and the Navy leaders, to their credit and their nimbleness of mind, said, hey, we're not going to make these submarines and pull them out of the fleet and just make them coastal defense assets. We're going to turn them loose and allow them to operate independently as stealthy attack platforms. But these ships were small. They had limitations to the amount of fuel and ammunition and torpedoes that they could carry. So if they were going to operate in the Pacific, they needed forward bases. So they tasked a young lieutenant commander by the name of Chester W. Nimitz to build a submarine base at Pearl Harbor. Now there's a whole story behind that. He got 4 chiefs. He went to another Navy base, literally stole a lot of equipment, loaded it on a ship, and sent it to Hawaii. And he still made admiral. Now, aircraft carriers like submarines were also intended to first serve as scouts for the battleships. But once again, a funny thing happened on the way to the dance. The Langley, the USS Langley, was a good start, but that was all it was. It was a start, and everyone in the Navy knew it was just a start. A special policy board convened by the Secretary of the Navy in 1924 stated that while the new technologies associated with naval aviation were promising, there was not sufficient promise of change so as to change the central role of the battleship. So but that didn't stop us. We converted treaty cruisers into the Lexington and the Saratoga, and they were the first steps towards really changing the Navy to a true carrier force. Now, in the beginning, both at Newport and during these fleet exercises, there was a lack of imagination on how to use the carriers. They were brand new. Again, this was primarily a battleship Navy. It was as if the carrier was a blank sheet of paper that the Navy really was hesitant to write upon. So the initial fleet exercises actually kept the carriers close to the battle line or used the aircraft for defensive roles over the battle line. The idea of a carrier attacking other ships appeared in the wargaming as early as 1921 in Newport, but it wasn't until 1927 that it was tentatively employed in a fleet exercise. And it was not until a year after that, during Fleet Problem 6, that carrier aviation was really turned loose to innovate. The control of air operations for the Blue Fleet was delegated to a commander of an air wing aboard Langley, Captain Joseph Mason Reeves. And he operated all 14 of the aircraft embarked upon the Langley around the clock, logging 116 hours during the exercise, providing scouting fleets on the Black Fleet, the bad guys, and in a real departure from previous exercises, he carried out simulated attacks on the enemy ships. And a few years later, during Fleet Problem 9, carriers attacked carriers with aircraft for the first time. Now, while all this is happening, we're experimenting with aircraft. Gosh, in the 1920s and 1930s, it was astounding how fast things were changing, how fast the engines were changing, how fast our understandings of aerodynamics were changing. And they were advancing at an astounding rate. We had fighters, we had torpedo planes, we had dive bombers, all of them used with differing levels of success. Confidence in the torpedo planes dropped, even as the effectiveness of the dive bombers went up. Lighter than aircraft, dirigibles, they proved unworkable generally as a fleet asset and disappeared from the inventory altogether. But the fleet exercises gradually started to experiment with a new force structure that pivoted around the aviation, with battleships and cruisers arranged in defensive screens around the aircraft carrier. At the same time, the physical structure of the Navy was changing, and so was its organization. Prior to World War I, the Navy was guided on a day-to-day basis by the Secretary of the Navy, with the assistance of a group of bureau chiefs who advised them on everything from navigation to ordnance to shipyards. Some of these innovators pushed the Navy to develop a general staff of uniformed officers to handle the day-to-day operations of the service. And in 1915, the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations was created. And for years after, although it was relatively weak and power continued to be exercised primarily from the Secretary's office, in an incremental, step-by-step, very patient, very methodical, very deliberate way, the collaboration between the CNO's office, the General Board, and the Naval War College began to rapidly evolve the staff of the Navy. And it occurred where the United States fleet had a battle force, its air battle force, and its scouting forces. And these components were experimented with. And throughout this time, the Newport Games and the 21 fleet exercises that followed figured out how this fleet was going to fight together. At the same time, the Navy was looking at its basing structure, its repair facilities, its fuel depots, its tenders. And it had very little money and a small industrial base, so it shifted its outlook from these big decisive battles to a prolonged campaign focused on the control of key locations at Pearl Harbor and at Midway and the Marshall Islands. At the same time, the Marine Corps considered how to explore as an integrated fleet marine force to conduct amphibious assaults which would seize those advanced naval bases to support the drive across the Pacific. What this all means is when the Battle of Midway happened, it was simply the culmination of an extremely long, mostly peacetime effort dedicated to the practical study of war. Admiral Chester Nimitz began his career as a surface warfare officer. He ran his ship aground, still made admiral. This guy was the luckiest admiral in the world. And I mean lucky in the best sense. He became a submarine officer. He built Pearl Harbor submarine base from the ground up. He graduated from the Naval War College. And he was ready to rebuild the Navy and fight the Pacific campaign the moment he became the commander. Because he later remarked, and I'm sure you've all heard this famous quote, I was asked once how we were able to fight the war in the Pacific. And I said that we had fought it just as we had fought it all on paper in the Naval War College. I fought the whole war of the Pacific while I was there. Raymond Spruance, he'd been the guy who seemingly couldn't stay away from Newport. He had a keen strategic mind. He spent 6 years there, both as a student and as an instructor. So on May 27, 1942, he had just come back from the South Pacific commanding a cruiser fleet. He was asked to go see Admiral Nimitz. He says, okay, I'm probably going to get fired. No. He walked in the office and they said, hey, this is your lucky day. Admiral Halsey is sick, so you are now the commander of the carrier force. Okay. Take your carriers right now and get out to Midway by June 4th. And how did this happen? How could somebody who jumped from a cruiser command to a task force in the front of an oncoming Japanese juggernaut, how could he do this? It was because he had fought that war 1,000,000 times. He had been at Point Luck 1,000,000 times, all on the gaming floors of the Naval War College. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, he began his career in battleships and destroyers before transforming to aviation. And this experience was pivotal because he's leading the force out, looking for the Japanese ships, and he can't find them. And he sees a Japanese ship leaving a long turbulent wake behind it as it sped northwest. He's a former ship handler, So it looked to him like the cruiser was hurrying to catch up with the carriers. So he ordered the force to turn and follow. For the Marines, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon, who manned the defensive positions at Midway, this was a set-piece battle to defend an advanced base. This was in the wheelhouse of the United States Marine Corps. It is something they had been practicing how to defend, assault, and also defend advanced naval bases. So this was a battle that they too were prepared for. So, if, when designating the decisive location of the coming Battle of Midway, if the sailors and Marines of that time were indeed trying to send us a message to those of all of us who followed, it was that there was nothing lucky about Point Luck at all. It was simply a position on the map and part of a battle plan that was the product of 2 decades of strategic thought and technical innovation by a professional officer corps supported by great sailors on very little budgets. So said another way, while they hoped that most events and circumstances would break for them in the battle, and indeed they did. Their naming of Point Luck was to tell all of you future warriors and all of the warriors that came after them that they needed to adopt the Branch Rickey view of what luck is all about. Now, nobody knew Branch Rickey in 1942. Okay, but they had heard his thoughts before, expressed differently by many great men, such as Seneca, the great Roman philosopher, statesman, dramatist, and humorist during the Silver Age of Latin literature. As he put it, luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. A lot of people think Oprah Winfrey said that, but she stole it from Seneca. Or Thomas Jefferson, I am a great believer in luck, and I find the harder I work, the more I have of it. Or Ralph Waldo Emerson, shallow men believe in luck, strong men believe in cause and effect. All of these ways, in different ways, say that luck truly is the residue of design. So I want to leave you all tonight just to ponder a couple questions, because I asked these questions of myself as I prepared for this speech. Before the Battle of Midway, it had been 44 years since the last major battle of the United States Navy, off of Cuba against the not very good Spanish fleet. Today, it's been 69 years since our last major fleet action. Are we heeding our predecessors' messages? Do the men that are represented by these 7 heroes tonight, are we heeding what they went through to get ready? Are we really putting Branch Rickey's model to work? Where are we systematically studying the future of naval warfare? At the Naval War College? I'm not so sure. Who will be the leaders of the next Battle of Midway? Are they studying war right now at the Naval War College? I hope so, but I'm not so sure. And we need to make sure that that happens. What warfighting community in the Navy will allow the future Ray Spruance to first be a student and then be instructor at the Naval War College and then be promoted to admiral? I'm not so sure. In an organization dominated by enterprises, who might describe the new Navy fighting machine? Not to find out how they fit in the war perfectly, but to find out how we should be modifying our current plans and our current organizations to take into account the full capabilities of the platforms now entering the service. What is the current state of our wargaming? It's pretty good at a small level, but certainly not at the grand scale practiced by the Navy in the interwar period. Do we have the institutional slack to experiment? I can tell you right now, absolutely not. The demand from the COCOMs is relentless. It's because the Navy and Marine Corps team is such an awesome element of our national power. You can't have enough of it. So every bit of our organization is used. So when do we have these big fleet exercises? We don't. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe to the bottom of my soul in the Navy Marine Corps team. It's been an important part of my life from the time I was born into a Marine Corps family, to my 27 years as an officer in the Corps, to my 4 years as undersecretary. I believe in its people. I believe in its training. I believe in its equipment, and I believe in its indomitable spirit. But I want us all, everyone, both active and reserve, retired, to think about and ponder the real lessons of Point Luck and to ask ourselves, are we doing everything we can to make sure that when we go to the next Point Luck against a big naval opponent in a dire set of circumstances, will we be able to accomplish what the men represented by these 7 heroes tonight were able to do? I know we can. We owe it to the 7 brave men who were representing all of the people who did it before us, and all of the sons and daughters who now are serving with us in the greatest naval force in history. I look forward to working with all of you to make it so. God bless you all tonight. God bless all of those in harm's way, our Navy Marine Corps team, and our glorious nation, which we are so honored to defend. Thank you.
Bob, thanks for that. That was really incredible. When your name first came up as a nominee to speak tonight, and I said, I remembered your AFCEA breakfast speech in January, February in San Diego, and it was such a rich discussion that I said, this has got to be something magnificent, and it truly was. So I thank you for that. For you, the seminal book by Tom Hone.
Thank you so much.